If you want the synopsis of tonight's lesson, chapter 5 is a guy who writes a letter and says, hey, can these people do it? In chapter 6 is a guy who writes a letter back and says, sure they can, and you need to pay for it. And there you go. That's the lesson. But we'll get a little bit deeper into that as we look through and such. Remember, as we are working through, Ezra divides pretty evenly into two groups. Chapters 1 through about chapter 6, and then about chapter 7 through chapter 13. Zerubbabel is the headliner in the first part that we're covering. Ezra will be the headliner starting next week, or close to next week, Lord willing. And then Nehemiah will be the guy in charge in his book, and Ezra will show up every once in a while over there. But as we get started, we'll get going here. Remember where we've been and what we've been doing. We started in our last lesson. They had laid the foundation of the temple. They had just gotten back. It's time to lay the foundation of this temple. They've gotten the altar built once again. They've gotten a bunch of the sheep and a bunch of the bulls and a bunch of all the stuff that they sacrificed. And so now the sacrificial system is going. We are starting to crank back up. We are coming back from captivity. Now the worship is starting. And the people up in Samaria, which is just north of Jerusalem, Samaria and Jerusalem are both, or Judah, are both in the same province or state that's called the land beyond the river. And the capital of the state's located up there in Samaria. And so the people up in Samaria saw that Jerusalem was building. They got a little bit nervous, which they should have, because Jerusalem was a little bit better situated on the trade route. And so if Jerusalem gets powerful, suddenly Samaria loses its influence, loses a lot of money. And plus, they just don't like the Jewish people. The Jews and Samaritans, even going into the New Testament, aren't going to like each other at all. So you'll see in chapter 5, the very last verse, the Jews get intimidated. They send a letter, the enemy send a letter to the king. The king says, nope, you can't build anymore. And so they just stop. And so everything is just stopped here. And so we go through 15 years of nothing happening. And then we enter into chapter 5. And right here at chapter 5, we have a cluster of activity happening in the Old Testament. The last three of the written prophets. Now, we don't recognize all these prophets are hanging out because, you go through your minor prophets and you have the 12. But Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are doing their work. Malachi actually comes a little bit later in the book of Nehemiah. But as we go through, we see this foundation is built, and now it's time for us to take over, time for us to get back to work. And what these people need is a preacher, a prophet, a cheerleader, somebody to tell them, hey, it is time for us to get back and to do the work of God. So as we go through that, let's spend some time meeting these minor prophet books. You and I, because of the way in which we teach Bible class when we're kids, and actually the way we do Bible class even when we're adults, we really know David, and we really know Abraham, and we know Moses. You know Jesus and Paul and John and Peter. You've got those guys down. But these minor prophet guys, a lot of times we have no idea who these people are. Zechariah, Zephaniah. What's the difference between the two? Not a lot of us can say right offhand, right? They both have the letter Z in their name. That's about the only difference we know between them. And yet those 12, the minor prophets, is probably the most applicable part of the Old Testament to us today because it looks just like where the church is today. You see where the restoration has occurred. We have figured out, hey, Lord's Supper is supposed to be on the first day of every week. Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Baptisms for remission of sins. Hey, we figured that out. We've restored the church as far as its outward worship, as far as God's plan of salvation. But the world creeps in. Intimidation creeps in. Sometimes we get a little slack, and sometimes we get a little bit lazy and things like that. And so the minor prophets really speak to us, and we won't get into these minor prophets too much, but let's go ahead and just do a real quick view of what we're working with when we hit these minor prophets. Haggai. Some parts of the country, they call them Haggai. And I feel like no mama would ever name her kid Haggai. Are y'all Haggai people or Haggai people? Okay. You're good Southerners, Haggai, right? Okay. So here we go with Haggai. Haggai, as you'll notice, he'll preach. He gives about 3 different sermons, and the dates are given. And as he comes through, beautiful sermon here that preachers like when it's time to start talking about giving. Well, what's that sermon about? What is it we're going to do? Oh, is it time for you to dwell in paneled houses while the Lord's house remains in ruins? Okay, you ever heard a preacher preach about that? Pretty much? Me? Okay, yeah, a lot of people are like, I've heard you preach that sermon. Yeah, sure. Okay, is it time for you to dwell in a paneled house when your house lies in ruins? And more or less what Haggai is saying is, you know, guys, look at your checkbook. If he was living today, that's what he would say. People in this class still have checkbooks. Younger folks don't have checkbooks anymore. You ask a younger person about balancing their checkbook, and they'll look at you really crazy, won't they? But, all right, you look at your checkbook, or look at your app which shows where your expenses have been. Where does your money go, to God or yourself? Do your giving on Sunday compare to your house note? Does your giving on Sunday compare to your car note? Does your giving on Sunday compare to the meals that you eat and the food that you have? And what Haggai is saying is, people, I'm looking around here, and the temple, the foundation's laid, and it's been sitting here for 15 years, and nothing's done. And then I look, and you have really nice houses, and y'all have a lot of good stuff going on. Why isn't it that we're spending more time, not spending any time, working on God's house? Now, here's where the shortcoming comes when preachers preach about this today. This church building requires a lot of money, to build, requires a lot of money to maintain, but this church building is not a reflection of our devotion to God. It's nothing more than a tool for us to disciple and reach out into the world, right? Okay, the church building is not the church. The people are what really matters, okay? And so you can have a nice church building. You can worship in a lean-to or an old barn or in a rented house, rented building. Any of that, you're still faithful to God. Now, in the Old Testament times, the temple really did matter. And the temple really was a reflection of devotion. And so Haggai says, why are we not building? If you say you really love God, then you need to be out there building and working this sort of stuff. And so you go down in chapter 1 of verse 9, he says you plant, but you don't sow. You build, but nothing really ever happens. And he says it's like you earn a ton of money. You do overtime at work and then put your money in your pocket, but your pocket's full of holes. And he says what your issue here is not that you're not working hard enough, but that your emphasis, your focus is in the wrong place. Nelson Rockefeller, one time, richest man who ever lived, the guy had enough money, he bailed out the U.S. government twice. When recessions came and the U.S. government almost went broke, he had enough money to bail out the government twice. A journalist one time was real upset because he said, and the one person shouldn't have that much money. He said, Rockefeller, how much money you want? And he said, just a little more. You know, for him, it wasn't a number. He just needed more of it. Well, his focus was in the wrong place. In your life, I'm not saying for you to compare what you give on Sunday morning to what your house note is or your car note is, although there may be some biblical background to that. But what I'm saying is your focus, your thoughts, are they spiritual or are they physical? Are they on those things which will last and which really matter? Or are they on those things which really aren't going to matter a bit in just a short little while, in a short little time? And so he comes through and he has these things. You go a little bit later, chapter 2, verse 9. The glory of this latter temple is going to be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts, because in this place I shall give peace. You remember earlier when this foundation was laid, a lot of people were crying because this temple did not come anywhere close to comparison to Solomon's temple. Haggai says, listen, this place is a lot better than Solomon's temple. Now, why is it going to be better? What's going to happen in about 450 years? Somebody's going to be walking around in this temple talking to the rulers and teaching them. And somebody's going to be clearing out tables. And a little bit later, a guy named Peter is going to be preaching the very first gospel sermon, right? Jesus is going to walk in this temple. And so this place is special. This place needs to, as Haggai says, be treated very special. And of course, the last one there, chapter 2:23, a focus on Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the forerunner of David, and so he's like a signet ring. He matters there. And so here we go. We see this guy coming in and this guy doing this work. And so this is our first prophet that comes through. And as he comes through, he's saying, wait a second, people. You were intimidated 15 years ago. That king's dead. Those people up there who were after you are dead. Why is nothing happening? Why don't God's people care? All right? Now, does that apply in today's church? Oh, sure it does, right? Got a lot of people who know the gospel. We've got the most powerful message known to all mankind. Are we doing anything with it? Are we reaching out to our community? Are we growing spiritually ourselves and helping people in our family grow? Or are we just sitting on what we got and just kind of hanging out? And so that's where you got Haggai. All right. Zechariah. Okay? And I don't really know if that's Zechariah. It's just this really old guy that looks spaced out. And if you read Zechariah, you think he's a really old guy who's spaced out. Some of these guys in the Old Testament, and I don't mean to be, flippant, but some of these guys, Ezekiel and these other guys, the visions that they come up with, they're impressive. Well, Zechariah comes across with 8 visions. And he is a forerunner of what you're going to read of in the book of Revelation. A lot of Revelation is John taking Ezekiel, and John taking some of the Psalms, John taking Zechariah, and he takes some of the symbolism, but he changes it and applies it to the message that he's getting across. And it's apocryphal, which means there's a lot of symbolism going on. So you and I will run through these 8 visions, and we just think, okay, what in the world is going on here? But Zechariah preaches same time as Haggai does. He doesn't focus on the temple as much, but he focuses a lot on how Israel needs to get back in motion. You need to get going again. A lot of people say Haggai works on the outside. Zechariah works on the heart. Haggai is, hey, if you get your actions right, then that shows that you're right. Zechariah more or less is saying, hey, listen, if you get your heart and your mind right, everything else will follow. Well, what are some of these visions? Well, that first one, 7 through 17, is the horses. The horses go out throughout the land. They're destroying everything, but they are merciful to Jerusalem, and they spare Jerusalem. 18 through 21, the 4 horns, which go out and destroy all the world. God is using the nations of the world to judge, but he shall be righteous towards God's people. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. I like this one. It's a measuring line. He goes around, he measures everything. And here he's showing, hey, it's only a matter of time. The city, which everybody considers to be nothing right now, the city's going to be filled up. It's going to be filled up with God's people, and God will greatly bless them. Chapter 3, 1 through 10 is an interesting one for us. You got the high priest, Joshua. Now, you see the high priest, Joshua. Joshua is a Hebrew name for what in the Greek? Jesus. Okay, so Zerubbabel is going to be the kingly line of Jesus. Joshua, through the priesthood, is going to be the priestly line of Jesus. And so you see these 2 men working together. We're saying, hey, in 400 years, we've got the Messiah coming. All right. Well, Joshua appears up there about to do his sacrifices, and his clothes are absolutely filthy. And his clothes are filthy, and the Spirit appears, and the Spirit takes off the clothes of Joshua and puts on some perfectly clean clothes so that Joshua is now cleansed, so now that he can lead the worship. All right. Now, hopefully in the New Testament, that gives you some Galatians 3:27 vibes, right? When you're baptized, you are what with Christ? You're clothed with Christ. He covers you. His blood washes away our sins. Okay? Chapter 4, 1 through 14. You're hanging out at the end of the book of Revelation. You got your 2 olive trees. And these olive trees light up a lamp. It's coming directly. Think about how you make, maple syrup out of a maple tree. I've seen some buckets up here lately. People are trying to get some maple syrup out of some trees. Imagine a tap put on an olive tree and the oil runs down directly into a candle, and that candle lasts forever. Never has to be filled again. And Zerubbabel is saying that's Israel. God's Spirit will always give us the power to where God's people, the church, will never fail. Chapter 5, 1 through 4, you've got the flying scroll. And once again, you get some revelation going here, don't you? And you see where the dishonest will never be able to hide, and they will be judged. 5 through 11, you have a woman in a basket. Goes pretty close to the Whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation. Chapter 6, 1 through 8, you have the 4 horsemen. And these 4 horses and the chariots go through, and God is judging people in his own way. And he will judge everybody in his own time. All right. Now, that is a disservice to Zechariah, but if you do service to Zechariah, you're going to have to give him about 2 or 3 weeks to really run through that book. But I wanted to just give you a taste very quickly of these prophets who are appearing and a little bit of the vibe of what they're giving out. Haggai is saying, hey, build this temple. If you love God, this temple needs to be going. Zechariah is saying, God's going to judge the pagan nations. Don't you be intimidated by them. God's going to make sure that his people, his nation, stand forever. So you be faithful and everything will be okay. All right. And then we come to the Italian prophet Malachi. That's me joking. It's Malachi. Malachi, the very last book of the Old Testament. And as you begin studying him, he's like, where is my honor? Why is it that you're only getting the leftover, the lame, and that's what you're sacrificing? Why is it that you try to look like you're worshiping to everybody, but you're only giving halfway service to God? He says, God expects 100%. He expects every bit of us. And so where's my honor? Where's my reverence? All right. Chapter 2, verse 7. The lips of a priest should keep knowledge, and the people should seek law from his mouth. And he says, but my priests are lazy, and they aren't preaching what they're supposed to. They're just telling you the world news of the day, and they're just being entertaining. There's no Bible in anything they're saying. And he says, and my people need to know the Word of God, and they're dying because nobody will tell them the Word of God. See, pretty applicable today, isn't it? Chapter 2, verse 10, hey, don't we have one Father? If you got one Father, then why is it that you're treacherous one with another? Why do the rich pick on the poor? Why do people, what's happening quite a bit, and this is one of the things Malachi is famous for, is a lot of these Jewish people, especially the men, would marry a bride when they're 18, and it's pretty awesome. And then their ladies would get a little bit older, and as they got a little bit older, they would figure out some way they could divorce them, and they would go back and marry another young lady. Or they would say, oh, well, this marriage just isn't working out for me. I'm just going to go find somebody better, somebody who works better for whatever it is that I'm doing. And so Malachi says, listen, God hates divorce. Why does God hate divorce? Because it's treachery. It's not keeping your vows to the person to whom you've married. And he said that applies to these people not only about divorce, but about worship. Not only about worship, but about daily life. You're falling apart in every part of it. Chapter 3 and verse 17, the jewels and the crown of the Lord are God's people. You remember the book of Job? Satan comes up there, one of the sons of light, and what does God say? Have you considered my servant Job? Now, Job probably would say, hey, leave me out of this if you don't mind. But that's how God is. You remember back when we had pictures and a grandparent would be at church and they would say, hey, look at these pictures of my grandchild. And everybody else is thinking, well, it's a baby. Okay. But you have to say, oh, that's the cutest thing I've ever seen. Otherwise, the grandparent gets really mad, right? Now, that's not true. My grandkids are really pretty. We've got one coming, when? 6 weeks. Yeah, all right. I keep telling Cole, you're never going to sleep again. And he just grimaces because he does not understand what's coming. He just knows he's never going to sleep again. All right. Well, you see these pictures. These are the jewels. And God is so excited about every single one of us. God is proud of you. All right? That's something kind of neat there. And then as he closes, we got 400 years of silence before the Lord speaks again. I'm sending my son, the Messiah, and I'm sending one like Elijah to come right before him. And that's going to be John the Baptizer who will come. So those are our 3 guys who we see, and they'll be referenced every once in a while over these next couple of chapters, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So when you hear these guys, that's a little bit of background of who these guys are and what their attention is, what their focus is, what their sermon is. Build the wall, right? No, Nehemiah's build the wall. Build the temple, all right? Hey, get right with God. Realize his power is awesome. Number 3, stop going halfway. Give yourself completely to God. All right. Now, we've got a new governor in the land beyond the river, which is the Samaria, Jerusalem, Judea place. And his name is Tatnai. That's not exactly how you pronounce it, especially in the Aramaic, but it will be how we announce it tonight because I'm teaching class and I have a lisp. All right. Tatnai is looking around and he sees these people and they are building. The prophets have got them to building, chapter 5 and verse 2. And as they're building, Tatnai, the governor over there in verse 3, and Shethar-Bazai and some of the companions, look down there and they see that happening. And they start saying, wait a second, are they supposed to be doing that? Because not only are they building, but they're using government money to build. Now, government money is different than real money. I don't know how, but it just seems that way. A lot of people in government, what was it Senator Rockefeller said several decades ago, 1 billion, 2 billion, 1 trillion, eventually it turns into, big money. Well, it's that way when you're talking about other people's money. Well, here we are, government money is disappearing. He's a governor, so he realizes, hey, I ought to be paying attention to what's going on down here. And so he comes down and he says, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And I need the names of the people who are doing this. And so he sends his people down and they begin to look around and they explain to him, okay, Solomon, the great king, built this temple. We were carried into captivity in Babylon. Now we are brought back and we are told that we are to rebuild this. And so all of this is going on. Now, Ezra here kind of puts in, he's got a few little word plays that he throws in, and one in English points up there in verse 5. The kings at this time in Egypt and Babylon, all these places, they always sent out spies everywhere. And they were called the eyes of the king, the eyes and the ears of the king. And their job was, if they saw someone messing something up, if they saw someone who was future trouble, they were to immediately send a message back, and that message would go to the king, and that way the king could prepare himself before a rebellion came out. And so, in a way, this Tatnai, he is a ear, he's an eye of the king. He's looking and saying, are we about to have a rebellion here? Are we doing something we're not supposed to be doing? So chapter 5, verse 5 says, the eye of God, not the eye of the king, the eye of the God is on this situation. The king can say whatever he wants. God is in charge. That's what we're getting out of that. That's a lesson. The eye of God is over you. There's always an all-seeing eye watching you. That's a song we used to sing long, long ago. And so the question is, do these Jews have a right to build a temple? And so he sends a letter back, and you remember Cyrus is no longer king. There's a lot of political stuff happening. We're down to a guy named Darius now. And so they send a thing to Darius, and they say, hey, the Jews are building this thing, and they say they have permission. Can you check through your records and find anything? This is 15 years ago. We had no idea of, are they just making this up? And so that's what you got running through chapter 5 as you go through it. Is there a right to rebuild, and is there a record of the command? So now we get to chapter 6. And as we get over here to chapter 6, Darius, the king, replies. And as he replies, he comes back and he says, a search is made, and it wasn't found there in the capital. It was actually found there in Babylon. Now, that's interesting to us because if you remember the very first lesson we studied, we had Cyrus's cylinder. It looked the shape of a barrel, and it more or less said the exact same thing at the end of 2 Chronicles says. Well, in the same treasury, he looked and he found this letter. He pulled this letter out. It's the reason we don't have it today, likely. And he said, yes, according to this, there is a message of King Cyrus there in chapter 6, verse 3, that this house should be rebuilt and the offering of the sacrifices should go. And he said, in fact, we even have some of these, dimensions which are hanging out here, 60 foot by 60 foot. These dimensions are going to be coming. Now, recognize Solomon's temple is 60 by 20, but also, or 30 by 20, 60 by 20 by 60. And this is 60 by 60. So we're looking at the length and the up and down part of it. We're not talking about it because it's the same size as Solomon's temple. And then we can talk about that a little bit later anyway. And the dimensions of the temple, Solomon's temple, if you're interested in that, 1 Kings 6 of verse 2. And so he says, yeah, they're building it. And as a matter of fact, it is a substantial temple. 3 layers of rock, 1 layer of timber. The reason for that is that style in ancient times protected you from earthquakes. And maybe you've seen on the news what's happened in Syria, which is just north of the Judea area, and what's happened in Turkey as well. They had 2 major earthquakes, both over 7 on the Richter scale. And I think right now they're at 400 people dead. No, or is it 4,000 people dead? Or we're up to 12,000 people dead. Okay. They just keep finding more people and more people and more people. And it's absolutely amazing. I mean, we have tragedies in this country, and they just don't compare to tragedies in other countries. You know, 9/11, we lost a little over 3,000 people. Imagine 12,000 people. Imagine the reaction that would happen in the U.S. if something like that happened. And so, you know, they know about earthquakes, so they're building this to protect themselves from these earthquakes as you go through and as you see these things. So he says, yeah, they've got the right to do it. And he says, as a matter of fact, not only do they have the right, but you're supposed to be paying for this. Kind of a bummer, right? You're supposed to be paying for this, pay for the materials, and also be sure to be giving them the wheat and the oil and the lambs and the bulls that they need. So God is using these pagan people to say, hey, keep preparing, keep building this, and this is exactly the way that it needs to be going and these things which need to be happening. Now, all right, let's look at this next section. We get going, and the temple is built. And for people like me who just do your daily Bible reading and stuff and don't dig very deep, you run across, and this looks like the end of the story, and it's really happy. Yay, this is good stuff. There's a lot of deep stuff happening here. It happens in the month of Adar, I think. That is the month of February. Between January and February for us is what it would be called in 515. Now, the reason that's a big deal is 70 years before then is when the temple was destroyed. So there's the exact 70 years there. So there's 70 years between each wave of the exile and them coming back. All 3 come to about 70 each time. And then there's 70 years as well with the destruction of the temple. So it's really interesting seeing how that works through. Now there's a time or two, it looks like to be a year off. But they build it at this time. Another neat thing about it being in February is when Hezekiah, remember Hezekiah rededicated the temple? He was trying to give himself back to God in 2 Chronicles chapter 30, 13 through 22. The day that he rededicated the temple was about 3 weeks before Passover, which turned out to be this exact same day. Josiah, one of the last full-time kings, you had Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim, and some of these little kings that lasted for just a little while. But Josiah, when he rededicated the temple, remember they found the law, all of the priestess and everybody else. They found the law in 2 Kings 23, 21 through 23. Guess what the date was when they rededicated the temple? 5th day of Adar. And so you see there's kind of a calendar thing going here. There's a depth of this, D-E-P-T-H, a depth that you're seeing as you're looking through, being able to see some of this which is happening. Now, turn over with me, if you will, to 1 Kings chapter 8. I think we got time to do this. And this is when Solomon dedicates his temple. Longest prayer in the Bible. The guy prayed and prayed and prayed. And then he prayed some more. And let me look here. Here we are. 1 Kings 8 and verse 63. Okay? This is Solomon, richest man. He offers a sacrifice. He offers 22,000 bulls. Okay? Now think for a little bit. When they sacrificed an animal, not to get too graphic, they'd slit the throat and let the blood flow. Josephus says that during the days of Jesus, they would offer so many bulls over the Passover that sometimes the blood in the temple would get up to ankle deep. So you can imagine how gross and stinky that would be. All right, imagine what it looked like, sounded like, smelled like. 22,000 bulls, one after the other, getting hauled up on that altar and burned. In addition, 120,000 sheep. Okay? And so you see all that going on, and the fat offerings and the everything else. All right, now you come back to Ezra chapter 6. And as you get back to Ezra chapter 6, we're going to look at verse 17. And what I want us to notice, the folks here, they're not poor, but they're not Solomon. All right, it's a substantial amount of money that these people are spending. They offered sacrifices at the dedication of the house of God, 100 bulls. All right, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's still a lot of blood flowing. 200 rams, 400 lambs, and then this last part's interesting to me. Verse 17, they offer a sin offering, a lamb sin offering, 12 times, one for each tribe. All right. Think of the implications here. As you and I have read, it looks like Judah and Benjamin were brought back. That's what we see in the census there in chapter 1, and the Levites. So we're looking at 3 tribes. As they come back and they rededicate this temple, they're thinking bigger picture than 3 tribes, aren't they? They're thinking about every tribe. And of course, there are passages where you can see that when the northern nation turned evil, many people did come south, and so there were all 12 tribes present at times in the southern kingdom. But they offer a lamb, a sin offering, for every tribe. Now, has every tribe sinned? Yes, they have. And that's the reason they went into exile. And so here is the opportunity to purge themselves from that sin, to roll that sin forward to the cross. And so it is a rededication of the temple. This is the people's place, the people's house, and we have given ourselves completely to God. Then we line up the priests, the 24 groups, which it says goes back to the law of Moses. The 24 goes back to the days of David. And so each priestly class would come and serve for 2 weeks, and then they would rotate back out. And so you have all your Levites doing their things. All right, so at this point, the Passover is celebrated. And so you remember each family has to kill a lamb, has to put the blood in the doorpost. They have a special thing done in the temple where they celebrate the Passover lamb for the people who are back in exile and the people who are the world over, as they're trying to include all of them. And then they had the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's celebrated just the next week. And so we hit here at the end of 6. God's promise is fulfilled. His temple is in full functioning work. Everything looks right. Everything looks good. All right, trivia question. And it's a great trivia question because there's no answer. All right. What's in the Holy of Holies? When they rebuild this temple, what's in the Holy of Holies? What's supposed to be in the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant that's holding the rod of Aaron. It's holding the manna, which came down, and it's holding the 10 Commandments. Now, there's a lot of theories, okay? People in Ethiopia swear that they have the Ark of the Covenant, but they won't let anybody look at it. It's in an adobe house, and they only let one dude in there, and the dude is usually blind, which is kind of interesting. And he's always like, yeah, sure, it's in there. Why would it end up in Ethiopia? There's a lot of weirdness with that. Some people think, well, that's the way you run south if your invaders are coming from north. They have this weird doctrine about the Queen of Sheba and Solomon getting married, and that gave them a connection to get the ark. That's probably not where it's at. Was it hauled off to Babylon? That would make a ton of sense. But Titus's arch, built in a little bit after AD 70, where they destroyed Jerusalem, when you look at the arch and see the army returning to Rome, they have a picture of some people carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if it ended up in Rome, somebody would have found it. Was it taken out somewhere and buried, like in the Qumran community, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, to keep from pagans? Well, if it was, they forgot about it. So that's one of those interesting things. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? All right. Anybody have any ideas different than that you've ever heard? Jeremiah took it to Ireland. There you go. That's a long ways. Okay. Jeremiah is kind of an Irish name, isn't it? I mean, what is it, Raiders of the Lost Ark? Where did they keep it? Some warehouse, military warehouse, wasn't it? All right. Okay, that may be as good theory as all those others. Who knows? You know, there's always a question, who has it? Where did it go? And, what could have happened? Okay. Sure, you could take it to heaven. I don't know why God would want it in heaven, but it could happen. It's a mercy seat. But that bus barn, it could be in our bus barn. Kendall has done great work on cleaning that thing up, but there's a possibility. Some of that furniture we sold, it could have happened. All right. Some of the application. That's our resident doctor, by the way. All right. Here's our application. Number one, God always makes a way for his people. Hey, they're intimidated. They are busy. Everything's happening. God makes a way. If you're faithful, God makes a way. Number two, sometimes God uses pagan people for good reason. Read the first chapter of Habakkuk. God, you're good and holy. How can a good and holy God use an evil people? Well, the just live by faith. God's doing what God's doing. He can use Pharaoh. He can use Pilate. He can use Herod. He can use anybody he wants. That's how sovereign and powerful he is. Okay? Number three, when God provides a way, take the opportunity. All right? Long, drawn-out preacher joke, which you've heard a million times, so I'm not going to bore you. But the guy who's sitting there on top of the house, it's flooding, and a boat comes to rescue him, and he's like, nope, I trust in God. And a helicopter comes, nope, I trust in God. And then he drowns, and he gets up into heaven, and he says, God, I trusted you. Why did I drown? And God said, well, I sent you a boat and a helicopter. All right? God provides ways, but you have a part in that as well. You have a job as well. When God provides opportunity, he expects his people to rise up and build, as Haggai would say. There's sometimes in life God's provided things for me and for you, and we just haven't taken opportunity for it yet. Number four, respect the past, but see the potential for the future. Man, Solomon's temple was awesome. But this future temple's even better, okay? And number five, use what God gives you to serve him better. Never be satisfied where you're at. Use his gift to serve him. Okay.